It had been over 2 years since humanity had aided in the rebellion against the factions. 2 years since they had to drop in and worry about their own friendlies, those that they were trying to save, shoot them in the back just out of straight fear. And in 2 years, the pace of war is slowing. Not due to the fact that those humans don't want to fight, but due to the fact that the lines are spreading out and they're getting thin. They've learned through history, do not spread your supply lines too thick. If you do, you're going to be in a world of hurt and someone's going to bend you over sideways and you're not going to enjoy it. What complicated matters is that space is a three-dimensional battlefield in the most literal of sense. The only way to actually have a down compared to up is to get a duck or a goose or something along those lines. Yet even with all this tension, there was a wanting, a waiting to keep the momentum. They wanted it going. They wanted to push all the way through faction space, and no one exemplified this more than the Second Fleet, as they were demanding for every single mission. They wanted to keep going, yet they were waiting for more new ships and weapons that were trickling in throughout human space. There was not enough to keep the pace going, just not. As things expanded throughout, each section had to be protected. This meant that they had to leave ships behind, and this meant they had to wait for more ships to join them. It was just not enough to keep the pace going as fast as everybody truly wanted to. Due to this end, one of the captains of a battleship wanted to keep the momentum going and insisted that he could take the next sector with nothing more than a battle group. This battle group would nearly mirror the one that Earth used to protect itself against the original fight against Adeshnik. It would have one battleship, 2 cruisers, 10 destroyers, 10 frigates, and 40 corvettes. The next sector was believed to be simple. It only was a colony sector with one colonized world. A simple colony wasn't going to be very well protected, so why would the factions want to guard it? It wasn't in any of the major trade routes. This was going to be a cakewalk and should be simple. However, the problem is they didn't wait for permission. As soon as they believed everything would be fine, they jumped. The battle group jumped inside the sector instead of outside the sector as it normally does. They wanted to blitzkrieg the enemy lines, and this was what they got. Jumping in midway, they were outside the fifth planet's orbit as they worked their way towards the second planet, which was the colony world itself. They realized with a group this big, it wouldn't be hard to take. Population at maximum was 500K, up to 1 million. Absolute maximum capacity. So they knew it would be far easier to take than that. Making their way past the fourth planet orbit, they started getting blips on their sensors, and the sensors were just starting to go crazy. They couldn't really make sense of what was going on. The readings were just out of this world, literally. They couldn't figure out all that was going on. They were already at general quarters, as that was standard, so they didn't really worry. They figured that their own personnel would be able to take out whatever was going to happen. At that point, they began to read multiple signatures coming out of warp, and along with multiple signatures coming in on their way towards them at flank speed, they turned their guns and were quickly ready to fire. The sensors were reading in all directions. Every single direction was an enemy signature, and they were warping in. They were using their warp to get in as close as they could, launching torpedoes as soon as they were out of their own warp, and right behind that, they began to fire their main guns. As they were close enough for the human secondary weapons, i.e. the turrets, they knew they only had about 30 seconds before the strike. Immediately, over the PA system, you could hear, "Vampire, vampire, vampire, set all doors and hatches to condition Z." Everybody knew what that meant. You're about to be hit. It was going to be another 12 seconds before impact by the time they were all sealed, and everybody just got ready. Just before the first rounds hit, all you could hear was, "Brace for impact!" And the alarm was sounded. The point defense systems were able to deflect about 90% of the incoming fire and torpedoes. However, that also meant that 10% were getting through. Realizing he'd been caught with his pants down, Rear Admiral Churchill, in charge of the battle group, said, "Cheeky little bastards," and immediately ordered his corvettes and frigates to withdraw as soon as possible, and the main frontline ships would take on this assault. His pride in his own ships was going to be taking this enemy on, basically muzzle to muzzle when it comes to space combat. He was confident in their chances, even though he realized he was completely outflanked. About half of the frigates and 70% of the corvettes were able to get clean, and they blinked away using their jump drives. The remaining forces tightened their lines and formation as the battleship shifted around to get his main gun to bear. As it fired, it began to strafe the front lines, not piercing, but ripping through dozens of ships with each shot, as the beam itself would be several dozen of kilometers long. After the second shot, though, the fire controlman stated that they were running hot. All they heard is, "Continue firing!" The third shot, red lines everything inside the cannon. The enemies were still closing, and they were not happy as they continued to fire as much as possible. They had not come in with a lot of drones to cover any type of withdrawal at all, so they were stuck where they were. And now the losses began mounting. The rear admiral didn't even have a chance to call for withdrawal as the next hit took his jump engines offline. Hull breaches were being taken far too quickly for the damage control teams to patch them all up, and he was watching ships get disabled as more of the enemy closes down on them. After the cruisers went silent, he ordered his main gun to fire again into the largest enemy formation. The weapons officer screamed, "Sir, sir, it'll melt down if we fire again." All he got in response is, "Then take those slags to hell with us!" The main gun fired again, taking out more of the enemy, to include a battleship and a cruiser, along with several destroyers, and as the debris field from there expanded from the explosions of their own engines, it was a flying junk heap as many ships were being taken down by flying debris. The ship jerks violently as the main gun seizes up and melts down at the same time. So many mechanical pieces try to move, tear themselves apart, turn into molten slag, or simply bind together as though thermite had been dropped on them. This began to short out many of the other quantum engines they were using, and they had to switch up to backup power. At this point, only 42% of the battleship's QCs, quantum capacitors, were still functional. The turrets were now at half power, which was going to take them a lot longer to charge up to be able to fire. The life support system was gone, just completely fried. The point defense system was malfunctioning, seemingly firing in random directions, if it did fire at all. The ship shook again from another impact. The few sensors still working showed enemy moving in to take the ships. The battle group was being boarded. They began preparations to scuttle the warship. And as they started getting everything ready to blow this ship apart, turning this whole entire area into a supernova, the last of the few sensors still working began to send all sorts of warning. There was energy spikes coming in, and they thought, well, we don't have to scuttle the ship. This ship is fucked anyway. Along with that, a radio message came across. "Don't worry, love. Cavalry's here." With that, an entire second fleet had just arrived, and they arrived all guns blazing. The enemy didn't have any choice as they immediately withdrew. Their losses were staggering as they retreated, but some of them still were able to warp away as they were farther out, and they were in a hell of a rush. The majority of the Second Fleet stopped to assist and recover all personnel and equipment, but not all of them. The flotilla that was trying to take the colony continued on its way there, and since they didn't receive any response when the colony was given an order to surrender, the pods were dropped as soon as they were ready. But to their surprise, they only found a colony littered with the dead and dying. It was a horror show, just as bad as in space. As they landed and ran out, they saw some so weak they couldn't even get up to run. Some of them tried crawling away. It seemed as though their legs or lower appendages or giant tails, whatever they might have, were just not working. They were so weak from malnutrition and no water for even the past few days that many of them just laid there waiting for death. Some of them were done waiting. They immediately went from invasion to recovery operations. Unfortunately, out of a colony that should have had several 100,000, the personnel recovered was 222, and that was it. Losses from the enemy was 61%. Losses of human vessels. One battleship that was so overcooked it had to be stripped for parts, completely decommissioned. It was done. The two cruisers were beaten the hell out of, but they were salvageable. Cruisers are like that, usually not targeted, but they do take a hell of a beating. Out of the 10 destroyers, 8 of them were just gone, and 4 frigates were lost. All others that were supposed to be in that battle group had been sent away with the drop troopers. Looking over everything, it was a tactical victory, but a complete strategic loss. This was just too much that they could bear. The enemy had tested a new tactic, and now they know they can come in and hurt the human ships. They use the warp to get in very close, close enough that it almost completely mitigates the main guns of the battleships, also mitigating the range advantage, and they were overwhelming them with numbers. This was horrific for everyone, and all advancements were put on hold until they found a way to counter this. The Rear Admiral was definitely held to task. He tried to use his political influence to keep from any type of repercussion, tried to blame his crew, blame the ship, blame everything but himself, saying that if this, if that, but no, not this time. They had learned from history. Such losses could not be overlooked. You couldn't hide this anymore. Ranks and titles from the Rear Admiral were removed, and he had to retire in disgrace and shame. He let pride in his ships. Why? Because all he knew was ships. As they say, if you're a hammer, every single solution looks like a nail. And because of this pride, he lost so many personnel, so many ships in this, to include an entire battleship. It was insane. He realized it was a trap, and yet he decided to fight it out. He had the choice to withdraw, and he didn't. Because of this, they initiated new doctrine changes. The changes were simple, though. You would think they would be obvious, but since they had had so much successes, they had not thought, maybe, just maybe, we'd have to change everything up. The enemy was not stupid after all. They would figure out something. They would test everything and eventually find something that worked. But now that they have something that works, we have to find a way around it. One of the first changes was any jump into a system was done at the very edge of the system. This was commonplace for the factions, and now they knew why. They didn't realize why the factions wasted so much time crossing so far, and they turned out that they were scanning. They were making sure they weren't walking into an ambush, which is exactly what the Rear Admiral did. At this point, no less than 2 battleships per assault, regardless of the target, regardless of what glory might be there, what type of resistance might be there. Withdrawal from the battle space is 100% authorized unless you are unwilling to do so, i.e., no human tech, or humans for that matter, would be left behind, ever. The entire formation would change as well. Frontline ships obviously would be in front, and secondary ships would wait for a while, roughly about 10 minutes, before they would jump in. Things like ships used for deploying pods and additional personnel and medical ships, things of that nature, would stay behind and come in on the second wave. Any additional support ships, like civilians, would stay behind until called. This included the ever so delicate hospital ships. Above all else, always call for support. Always. There was no reason for those losses. Maybe one or two to be lost from a stray shot, but there was no reason at all for those losses. The Second Fleet could have got there a hell of a lot faster, as quantum entanglement communication is very commonly used. They could have got the Mayday within, 2 seconds by the time it was sent out? If they wanted direct communication, they still would have got instant transmissions. This is just pride kicking humanity right in the nuts. When all was said and done, the sector that they had just cleared with a single colony world was originally going to be left abandoned, as there was no sentient species homeworlds that was still there. Due to this fact, the abandoned sector would be used as a staging area for the Second Fleet going forwards. Also, they would use the abandoned colony to practice their combat operations, in particular drops, at least until they collapse under the damage by all those athletic alcoholics that like to drop in from orbit. Even with all the new ROE, the rules of engagement that are going on, the war just simply drags on. There's a massive amount of space to cover, many, many planets that need to be taken, many different sectors that need to be secured, as there's a very good reason why you want certain ones. As they liberated each of these homeworlds, and their sectors, of course, the diversification of species waiting to go home was getting smaller and smaller. And with every new victory, the Allied forces, the aliens that they have actually freed, continues to expand. And they were all chomping at the bit to get into the fight. As it turned out, there was more volunteers than were needed to pilot the captured ships that got refit by the humans. So what do you do with those? The extras, that is. Well, that's easy. You teach them how to drop. This is something that's exclusively human, as no other species has needed to know how to drop in through orbit. They've never actually even thought of it. They always bring things in through corvettes or frigates, which is why the initial invasion from the Questfart failed so miserably, as they brought in very large ships that were very easily targeted. As they began this training in the abandoned sector, they found out really quick that only certain species can even handle a drop. Many species were more than a little upset at this until they were shown exactly how difficult it was, how much of a strain it put on the body, and they quickly realized that their own shells, their own endoskeletons would just not be able to maintain it. However, that wasn't to say they were going to throw them away. No, they turned them into the shuttle corps. The shuttle corps has its own infantry, armor, and was tasked with getting all this down to the surface as reinforcements and immediately grabbing the wounded and heading back up into orbit itself. This made them extremely happy, as they all wanted a little payback for what the factions had done to them. Revenge, it's a great motivator. By the time they were certified, ready to go, approximately 52% of the Muggensloot territory had been retaken. Though the invasion had definitely slowed down from the start, it was not stopping. There was always a battle going on somewhere. The Allies were worried, though. The next jumps were going to take them to the core worlds of Muggensloot territory. They once asked a human, "How could we possibly break the space defenses inside these sectors? I mean, they're so robust." The human, he asked, turned and answered, "Well, that's easy. We'll just have to break out the big guns." Every single Xeno stopped that heard that and turned and looked, just as the alien ally asked the question they all had on their minds. "The big guns?"